Barron Trump had always been taught that respect and humility were key to handling any situation. Despite his last name carrying weight wherever he went, he preferred to let his actions define him rather than the legacy he was born into. That was why, on a chilly Friday evening, after a long day of traveling, he found himself in a quiet town, standing outside a small, locally owned restaurant, simply wanting a meal. The town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, wasn't the kind of place where high-profile figures were expected. It was a blue-collar community built on hard work and strong opinions. The kind of place where people knew each other by name, where loyalty ran deep, and where, sometimes, strangers weren't always welcomed with open arms. As Barron pushed open the door, a small bell jingled, announcing his entrance. The restaurant had a cozy, old-fashioned charm. Wooden booths lined the walls, the air smelled of sizzling steak and fresh-baked bread, and a faint tune from a country radio station hummed in the background. Conversations filled the space in a low murmur. For a moment, it felt just like any other small-town restaurant. But then, everything changed. As Barron stepped toward the hostess stand, a middle-aged woman behind the counter caught sight of him. Her pleasant, welcoming expression faltered, only for a split second, but Barron noticed. It was the same shift he had seen before. The recognition, the hesitation, and then, the judgment. He saw her glance toward a waiter in the back, exchanging a quick, silent message. The mood in the restaurant seemed to shift. A few heads turned. The air grew slightly heavier. Barron didn't react. He simply smiled politely. "Table for one, please." The hostess straightened her posture, setting down the menu she had just picked up. Her tone, when she spoke, was stiff, almost rehearsed. "I'm sorry, but we're not serving guests right now." Barron raised an eyebrow slightly. He glanced around. The restaurant was far from empty. Families sat together in booths, couples shared quiet conversations over dinner, and a few older men at the counter sipped on coffee. There was no closed sign on the door. Nothing about the place suggested that they were not taking in new customers. His gaze returned to the hostess. "I see," he said, his voice calm. "May I ask why?" The woman hesitated, her fingers tapping lightly against the podium. She wasn't expecting that. Most people would have simply turned around and left. But Barron wasn't most people. The silence stretched between them, and she shifted uncomfortably. Then, without offering any real explanation, she simply said, "We reserve the right to refuse service." There was. The weight of those words settled into the air like a cold gust of wind. The people sitting closest to the entrance were pretending not to listen, but Barron could feel their eyes on him. A man at the counter shifted in his seat, stirring his coffee a little too aggressively. A woman near the window glanced at him, then quickly looked away. He could feel the unspoken tension. Still, Barron remained composed. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed. He could have walked out. He could have called someone, made a scene, or demanded an explanation. But instead, he simply asked, "Does the owner know about this?" The hostess' lips pressed into a thin line. She was about to respond when a deep voice cut through the tension. "I know." A man, possibly in his mid-50s, stepped out from behind the kitchen door. He was broad-shouldered, with a dust-covered apron tied around his waist. His name tag read Charlie. He wiped eye. Barron turned to face him, offering a polite nod. "Then maybe you can help me understand." Charlie folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "I don't got anything against you, personally," he started, his voice steady. "But folks around here, they got their opinions." Barron absorbed his words without flinching. This wasn't new to him. People often judged him before they even knew him. They assumed they understood who he was based on headlines, based on things he never said, based on narratives they had already decided to believe. "I see," Barron said, his tone still calm. "And you're willing to turn a customer away because of those opinions?" Charlie exhaled sharply. "Look, kid." "Kid?" Barron interrupted, arching an eyebrow. His voice wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he spoke. "I'm not here to argue with you, sir. I walked in here the same way as every other customer. I didn't bring cameras, I didn't demand special treatment, and I sure as hell didn't come here expecting a political debate. I just wanted dinner." The words hung in the air. A few customers had put down their utensils, fully engaged in the moment. The silence in the room grew heavier. Charlie shifted his stance. "It's not that simple." "Actually," Barron said, "it is." At the far end of the restaurant, an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, set down his fork. His weathered hands rested on the table as he spoke, his voice carrying across the room. "Boy's got a point, Charlie." The room seemed to collectively inhale. The man, who wore a faded veteran's cap, leaned back in his seat. "I don't care who he is. If he came in here just looking for a meal, you serve him a damn meal." Charlie exhaled through his nose, glancing at the older man, then back at Barron. His fingers curled around the edges of his apron. "You think people around here will be happy if I do that?" he muttered. Barron tilted his head slightly. "And you think they'll respect you more if you don't?" That hit differently. Charlie clenched his jaw. The room remained silent. Then, finally, Charlie sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "Take a seat." Barron didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or act like he had won some kind of victory. He simply gave a small nod and walked toward an empty booth. The conversations around the restaurant slowly resumed, though now with an air of reflection. As the waitress hesitantly approached his table, Barron caught the veteran's eye and nodded in silent gratitude. The old man tipped his hat in return. Charlie, still standing by the kitchen, ran a hand over his face, muttering something under his breath. Then, without another word, he turned to the cooks and barked, "Fire up the damn grill." Barron picked up the menu and studied it for a moment. Then, with a slight smirk, he looked up at the waitress. "I'll take whatever you're best at making," he said. For the first time that night, she smiled. The tension in the room didn't fully disappear, but something had shifted. And as the scent of sizzling steak filled the air once more, Barron Trump sat back in his seat, knowing that, tonight, he had changed more than just one mind. Barron Trump sat in the diner, the tension in the room still thick, but now mixed with curiosity. Some customers had gone back to their meals, but many were still watching, sneaking glances, waiting to see what would happen next. The restaurant manager, Don, leaned against the counter, arms crossed, as if weighing a decision. Finally, he exhaled and shook his head. "You know," Don said, rubbing his chin, "I never thought I'd be serving a Trump in my diner." Barron smirked. "Well, I never thought I'd be standing in a diner having to convince someone to let me eat." A chuckle escaped from a man in the back, but the tension still held. The younger guy who had been the loudest critic leaned forward in his seat. "So what? You think sitting here makes you one of us?" Barron turned toward him, his expression calm but unwavering. "No. But sitting here means I'm willing to listen." The words hung in the air for a moment. It wasn't what anyone expected him to say. He wasn't fighting back, wasn't storming out, wasn't demanding respect. He was choosing to stay. Don sighed, scratching the back of his neck. He glanced at his waitress, Mary, who was still holding the menu. With a short nod, he made his decision. "Mary," he said, "get the kid a burger." Murmurs spread across the room. The younger man scoffed, shaking his head, but he didn't say anything. Mary hesitated for only a moment before sliding the menu toward Barron. He didn't even look at it, he just smiled and nodded. "I'll take whatever you recommend," he said. And just like that, the mood shifted. As Barron waited for his meal, he could feel the weight of the moment. Some of the customers had gone back to their meals, but many were still watching. The old man at the counter took a slow sip of his coffee, eyes flicking toward Barron before looking away. The waitress moved behind the counter, preparing his order, sneaking quick glances in his direction. The younger guy in the booth was still tense, arms crossed. He clearly wasn't ready to let this moment go. He leaned forward. "You think this changes anything?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Barron met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't expect it to," he said. "But it's a start." The younger man scoffed. "A start to what?" Barron tilted his head. "A start to realizing that not every conversation has to be a fight." The guy narrowed his eyes like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms again, his lips pressing together in thought. Barron didn't push. He just let the silence sit between them. At the counter, Don watched the exchange. He wasn't sure what to make of this kid, this Trump sitting in his diner, not yelling, not pushing back, just existing in a space that wasn't built for him. And somehow, he wasn't making it worse. Finally, the old man in the work jacket spoke. He set down his coffee and sighed. "Kid's got a point," he muttered. The younger guy glanced at him, surprised. But the old man didn't say anything else. He just picked up his fork and went back to his meal. Sometimes, silence was louder than words. The smell of a freshly grilled burger filled the air as Mary set a plate in front of Barron. "Best in town," she said simply. Barron picked it up, took a bite, and nodded. "Not bad." Don huffed out a small laugh. "Not bad," he repeated. "That's a $10 burger, kid." Barron grinned. "Could use a little more seasoning." A chuckle rippled through the room. The tension cracked, just a little. The younger man in the booth shook his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered, but there was no real bite behind it. Barron took another bite, then set the burger down. "You ever wonder why people assume things about you before they meet you?" Don raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Barron gestured around the room. "I walked in here, and before I even said a word, people made up their minds about me." Don didn't deny it. He just exhaled. "Maybe," he admitted. Barron leaned forward slightly. "And you ever think maybe I've done the same thing?" That landed. Don frowned, considering it. The younger guy in the booth finally sat up, suddenly more interested. For the first time, the conversation wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. The diner had changed. It wasn't just a place of tension anymore. It was a place of conversation. Don finally leaned on the counter and sighed. "All right, kid. I'll admit, I expected you to walk out." Barron smirked. "Yeah, I get that a lot." A small chuckle escaped from someone in the back. The younger man in the booth rubbed his hands together, exhaling sharply. Then, almost grudgingly, he muttered, "Maybe I was too quick to judge." Barron turned toward him, eyebrow raised. The guy sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I still don't agree with a damn thing your family stands for," he said. "But I'll admit, I expected you to be some arrogant jerk." "You're not." Barron nodded, accepting the words. "Fair enough." The old man at the counter let out a short laugh. "That's the closest thing to an apology you'll get from that one." A few more people chuckled. Don shook his head, almost in disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Something had changed in that diner, and everyone felt it. Barron finished his meal, setting the plate aside. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "For the best $10 burger I've ever had," he said, sliding it toward Mary. She hesitated. "Kid, this is too much." Barron shook his head. "Not for the lesson I just got." Mary glanced at Don, who shrugged. "Take it," he said simply. Barron stood up, stretching his arms. "Thanks for letting me stay." Don exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Didn't think I'd say this, but you're welcome back anytime." Barron smiled. "I'll hold you to that." As he turned to leave, he glanced once more at the younger guy in the booth. "Maybe next time, we actually sit at the same table," Barron said. The guy snorted. "Yeah, we'll see." Barron just smiled and walked out the door. Inside, the diner wasn't the same. The conversation had changed. And sometimes that was enough. This wasn't just about Barron Trump. It was about perception, about judgment, about the moments when we have the chance to walk away or stay and prove something. And that night, in a small town diner, Barron chose to stay. And that made all the difference.